So I'm Hayley. I'm the training director at PMAC. We specialise in creating training related to anything that impacts the mental health or wellbeing of anyone. And we work primarily with businesses. Oh, we've got Geordie. I love that. Okay, so just before we go any further, as I said, so the camera function and microphones are disabled today, as I said earlier, for a couple of reasons. So trauma by its very nature can be quite distressing to discuss and think about. So I just want to forewarn people, we're not going into, traumatic events and thinking really in depth about types of traumas. However, we are going to be thinking about the impact of trauma, and that in itself can be enough to raise some emotions. So talking about this topic can make people kind of reflect on your own life, your own experiences. Because we've only got a short amount of time today, there's only 45 minutes, there is still a very good chance that actually what we're talking about might not personally resonate with you, and that is by no means a reflection of you and you reacting in a way that's so unusual or anything like that. It simply reflects the fact that we don't have a lot of time, and also it's not a one-to-one discussion, it's not as personalized. However, if anyone recognizes within yourself that it might be that you start feeling a little bit nauseous, you feel like your throat's going dry, you feel like you're finding yourself kind of welling up a little bit, your thoughts are changing, you're thinking back to experiences you've had or somebody else, please, please, please prioritize just looking after yourself. Take some time, do anything that helps you to feel grounded, feel safe, feel calm. And yeah, particularly after this session, I'd recommend for at least the 15 minutes before it gets to 2 o'clock, if your bosses presume that you're on here anyway, just take some time to do something for yourself. Tell them we were here till 5, if that helps. I'll vouch for you. Drop them my email and I'll say, yeah, no, we were here a while. And just do something to look after yourself. That's the priority, I suppose, going forward. So essentially today, all we're thinking about is what trauma is, why we experience trauma responses, and how that impacts us. And then what we're also thinking about really is understanding how lots of what we think of as mental health conditions can really be understood through a trauma-informed lens, and also thinking about moving forward. Now, I'm going to ask this question, does everything happen for a reason? And I don't particularly need a response now. However, I just want you to have this in mind. And I'm going to ask you the same question again later on at the end of the session. And you might recognise that you might have different thoughts on it at that point. You might not. That's absolutely fine. Nothing has to change. But it's just something worth thinking about, because when we're talking about trauma and stress, it's often a response that people will hear is everything happens for a reason, it's all going to work out, it's all going to be okay. And that might not feel like the case for other people. So what's trauma? Why are we all here? So trauma essentially is an emotional, a physical, a behavioural and a psychological response to a distressing event that maybe left you feeling, for example, unsafe, alone, unsupported, frightened, trapped, powerless, abandoned, rejected, ashamed. It's just a few examples, but trauma doesn't have to be one big event. Ongoing bullying, for example, emotional abuse, physical ill health can all be traumatic. The difference between stress and trauma is that stress, it can be challenging and it'll, lead to some temporary changes, but typically you're able to kind of come back to your baseline and calm down relatively quickly, hopefully. And it might be challenging, but it's kind of more of an opportunity afterwards for you to decide what you do with that information, and you decide how you move forward with that. At the core, however, trauma changes elements of you, not forever, but they make some changes. So it might change the way that you see yourself, see other people, the way you interact with the world. It might change the way that you experience emotions. You might experience emotions more strongly, for example. Physically, you might then experience things like changes with blood pressure, digestive issues, hair loss, fertility challenges, all these sorts of things. But a couple of things I want you to take away from today, if nothing else, is that understanding that all of these responses make sense. They've served a purpose, and also we can grow through trauma as well. And we're going to talk about this because in my experience as a psychological practitioner and my what feels like too many years now doing this stuff, I feel like too young to have been working in this as long as I have, all the trauma trainings I ever went on always felt like they were quite bleak, and they tell you all the unhelpful impacts of it. And there wasn't often a consideration of how people move forward, which felt like quite, bleak, really. So we've got above and beyond today to make sure that we absolutely include lots of hopeful things. So to understand trauma, we need to understand our body and physiological stress response. So if we experience a bit of a stressful event, our first response, our first kind of instinct is to seek social support. So it's not actually that fight, flight, freeze response, but to kind of seek support from other people, particularly people that help us to feel safe, which I hope you have plenty of in your life. So our instinct, as I said, is to kind of be around other people. Lots of people have heard of oxytocin, that kind of cuddle hormone, that love hormone. It's actually also a stress hormone. So in the face of stress, our first instinct is to get some support from other people. If we feel alone or we feel in immediate danger, what tends to happen is our lizard brain will kick in. And it's called our lizard brain because it's like the most primitive part of our brain. So our brains as humans have continued evolving over time. At the absolute core of it, we have this, what they call the lizard brain, and essentially that's responsible for survival. It'll tell you when you're hungry, it'll tell you if you're too hot, if you're too cold, it will tell you when you need to sleep, and also in the face of immediate danger, or if we feel alone and we feel unsupported, it will kick off our fight-flight response. So here we see a lizard with a pair of boxing gloves. I've not taken the photo myself, I hope the lizard was fine, but essentially in this kind of, when we're in that state, our body's preparing us to act. It wants us to change our circumstances in one way, shape or form, okay? So your body's going to be pelted with adrenaline. You are going to be go, 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 go. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in a bit. But essentially, what's called our sympathetic nervous system will kick off. Now, that can be quite overwhelming, being flooded with all that emotion. But essentially, even in that state, there are things that we can do to calm that self down. And we can use what's called our parasympathetic nervous system to help turn that off. So things like breathing techniques, very, very simple, but can be very effective. Now, if we feel trapped, we feel like we cannot do anything to change the circumstances, we feel powerless, we can't get away, as well as feeling alone, as well as feeling in immediate danger, our body plunges into this freeze state. So essentially at that point, our brain tries to shut us down a little bit to preserve energy, and it will kind of disconnect us from our senses. You kind of can't feel so much anymore. Your brain's trying to stop taking in information. Part of that is that you are not going to feel pain, which again serves a purpose. So if anyone's ever heard of someone, I don't know, for example, breaking a leg and saying, like, I didn't even feel anything, that's kind of like that shock, that disconnect, that dissociation. Your heart rate drops, which literally feels like, if anyone's ever had this, even if it was like on a roller coaster when you just kind of tipping over and you just start dropping, your heart might feel like it drops. You might feel like you're lost for breath. Your breathing will slow, your gut stops working. And pardon my French, you might literally lose your shit. You might find that you're excreting, for want of a better term, and you might be vomiting. So, for example, when I've experienced this, typically I would vomit. I would be lucky if I had about 30 seconds notice before you were seeing what I had for breakfast. In this state, even things like your hair follicles might get put to rest, which might mean that people lose their hair. Your reproduction will be put on pause because survival first. Getting pregnant at that point is not priority, which longer term can lead to challenges with fertility. But essentially, it serves a function, it serves a purpose, and it's your body's way of preserving your life, okay? And also, if, for example, the traumatic event relates to another person, not being perceived as a threat anymore because you're not fighting actually reduces the likelihood that you're going to be hurt even further. However, it can lead to things like gaps in memory. It can feel like you're watching yourself. It can be really, really strange to make sense of and challenging to sit with afterwards if you don't understand what happened and why it happened, and the fact that it wasn't your fault and that it wasn't just that you didn't do enough. So that's why it's really important to understand this. So a way to kind of understand it is this thing called the window of tolerance. So the idea is that we have these three states that we're kind of moving in and out of all the time. So essentially, we all have a window in which we are okay. So the window is this green bit in the middle with the boat. Sorry, just seeing a message there. What I'll do actually, I'll maybe come to the questions later and I'll kind of answer them all at once. And hopefully I might have answered some as we go along, if that's okay. So yeah, so in this window, life doesn't necessarily be easy, because it isn't. However, what it means is that we feel like we are capable, we've got the resources to kind of navigate that. So again, this is where in our window, our instinct is to get social support, I suppose. So in that window, we can problem solve, we can think clearly, we can remember feeling differently, which is extremely important. There's a sense that this is the current present, but there was also a past, and there's also going to be a future where things are different. We can use our imagination. So we can imagine that things are different. We can plan. We can self-reflect. We can play out different scenarios in our mind. We can imagine that things can improve in the future, and we can be soothed by other people. Now, so that's kind of the, oh, sorry. All right. Okay. I think my colleague Peter's dealing with the slides issue. So if we experience lots of stress and our brain becomes overwhelmed, we flip out of that window where things feel manageable into this, what they call like a hyper-vigilant, hyper-arousal state, which is that red bit up at the top with characterized by all these storms, okay? That is where the lizard brain lives. So if we are feeling really, really overwhelmed, we might feel angry, we might feel anxious, we might struggle to problem solve, things become very black and white. Everything is pushing us to feel, everything's pushing us to act on our emotions, essentially. Your senses will be heightened. It can become very difficult to distinguish between danger and safety. You're more likely to misinterpret other people's facial expressions as hostile. It's very, very much a safety first, if that makes sense. If, however, even in that, oh, sorry, people can only see the first slide. Right, thank you for letting me know. Bear with me. I will. All right, some people can see slide 7. Maybe, thank you everyone, maybe refresh Teams. That might help. Because it might just be frozen for you. Thank you everyone. Okay, so yeah, so essentially, if we're in that hyperarousal state up at the top, lizard brain's kicking off, it'd be like me, for example, with a lifelong fear of spiders, walking into a house and I can see a cobweb in the corner, but it's empty. My brain is going to be looking for danger everywhere. It's going to be like, there's danger here somewhere if we look hard enough, and it wants us to do something about it. However, again, we feel alone, we feel powerless, we feel helpless. The situation is so overwhelming, we can't, our brain doesn't feel like we can act to do something. It's going to plunge us then down into this hypoarousal, and it's characterized at the bottom there with like an empty battery, a bed. It's very much a state of kind of feeling nothingness. It's very, as I said, that freeze state, that collapse, that kind of shutdown, and it's extremely primitive. Like I said, even fish have this response. When we're in that state, memories aren't assembled properly into a story, so it can be really, really difficult to remember afterwards how things happened. You can lose your concept of time, so things can feel endless, which makes them way more intolerable. And you might start noticing people engaging in things like risk-seeking behaviour, so like fighting, drug use, promiscuity, all these things, because they're desperately trying to feel something. Now, trauma, particularly longer term trauma, can make that window smaller. And the other thing to understand is that repeated trauma will take us from, rather than kind of going through that process of I'm doing okay to let me at them, to plunging down into that kind of off state, your brain will go, do you know what? I know where this is heading. I know how I'm going to end up responding. So I'm going to skip out all this energizing bit up top, and you are going straight into shutdown, my friend. So trauma repeatedly can make that window smaller, and it can make it more likely that your stress response will then be straight into that shutdown state. So, for example, historically, again, it might be that rather than if someone sent me a text saying, oh, can we have a chat? Rather than kind of going into anxious state, I might just immediately vomit, which, again, wildly entertaining to be around. However, we don't necessarily have to get stuck there. So, the other thing to understand as well as, before we move on, is that it doesn't make sense for our brain to take us from that shutdown state straight back into our window where we're living the dream. So what we can see a lot of the time is when people have kind of been in that shutdown state, they might then come out of that, go into that hypervigilant state for a little bit. So they might go into this scrappy-doo, Scooby-Doo, let me at them, I'm running, I'm fighting, I'm doing everything, because some anxiety and apprehension is kind of needed for our brain to recognize, like, oh, actually, it is okay, I'm going to be okay. And then we might be able to move back into our window. And to kind of explain it, I love this little gif at the bottom, this like coyote, where you can kind of see that it's been running, and then you almost see the moment that it kind of freezes and everything drops. So, as I said, this isn't all about the challenges of trauma. We can widen our window. We can get back into our window and we can make it bigger. And actually, lots of people experience something called post-traumatic growth, where as a result of the trauma they've experienced, they end up actually being more resilient. They can handle more things. They recognize when they're kind of getting to the edges of about to be tipped out of the window, and kind of they're able to find their way back in. So all is not lost. And that also includes the physical health effects. So actually, again, we can get our blood pressure back to normal, fertility can resume, all that sort of stuff. So there's definitely hope. So that's one way of understanding trauma itself. But I think the challenge for lots of people is then understanding the lived impact afterwards and why that then changes the way that people behave afterwards. So at PMAC, we've come up with this way of understanding the lived impact of trauma. So you're not going to see this anywhere else. And we hope that you find that this makes sense. It goes down typically quite well with groups that we work with, but it's our way of understanding the impact. So if we think of windows, because the whole thing then was the window of tolerance, windows are like our way of, from the safety of our inside, interacting with the world and other people. And they're also a way that people kind of try to look in and get a little bit of a nosy. So how might trauma impact people's windows? Some people after trauma, depending on the type, depending on the length of the trauma, depending if it's repeated, for example, they might become very closed off. So they might batten down the hatches, they put up these bars, they put up shutters, they might lock them away. And essentially what they do is they kind of close themselves off from other people. They might become very withdrawn, which again kind of makes sense, because the more closed off you are, the more you keep yourself locked away and hidden, the less likely you are to experience further hurt. For other people, they end up opening the window as wide as they can. They've got the red carpet out, they've got the lemonade stand, everyone's welcome, they let everyone in, they're wide open, they're eternally optimistic almost, in the hope that the right people will find their way in. And they almost kind of are the opposite of the closed people, because they're like, actually, the world will be a good place and I just need to give myself the opportunity to experience that. However, what that means is they might leave themselves completely open and completely vulnerable. And within that, they might not think about the consequences or the impact for themselves of letting in the wrong people and being eternally optimistic. Other people might put out blackout curtains. So to those that are very close to them, they'll be open. However, they can be very rigid and they'll close off, and it can be very black and white in terms of letting other people in. Some people, they might create a whole show home. So with this, they feel better in themselves. They get a sense of self from other people's validation, their reassurance. So essentially, they might become a bit of a perfectionist. If they can make themselves as perfect as possible, they work harder than everyone else, they do the absolute best, they're overachievers, then there's almost no reason for anyone to possibly have anything negative to say or to hurt them. Again, it might also be that the show home can represent trying to visually make yourself look as beautiful as possible and seeking gratification from others. So that might be, or it might look like kind of, again, engaging in promiscuity, having affairs, engaging in sex work, having relationships with people who are married, because all of those things help them to feel valuable and worthwhile. For some people, the windows might be a little bit dirty, and that in theory you can kind of see in, however, it can be quite difficult to do so. So with people whose windows might get dirty, it might be that it can be difficult to know where you stand with people. You feel like from one moment to the next, you're not really sure where things are at. Maybe think people can be quite abrupt. It feels like you don't really know where you're at with them. So in theory, they're kind of letting you in, but it feels like they're also keeping you at arm's length. For other people, they create this one-way mirror, so they can see out into the world, they can see what's going on. However, to you guys looking in, they kind of become like you. They're almost like social chameleons. Whoever they're with, they absolutely agree with everything that they do. They love everything that they love. They adopt elements of their personality. Because again, if I'm like you probably you're going to like me. It reduces the likelihood of you seeing me as a threat or putting me in harm's way. Other people might keep their window tiny and they make themselves small, and people might make themselves almost invisible. So they never push themselves to reach their potential. They keep themselves very, very small because, again, it's safety, essentially. The more they're overlooked, the less attention is drawn to themselves. Other people might kind of light themselves up. So they'll do things really unexpected, potentially, that attract your attention that you feel like you can't ignore. It might be worrying or scary to kind of observe from the outside. You might perceive it that they've done bizarre things or scary things or risky things. And people might misinterpret this as being attention seeking, but essentially what it is, it's care seeking. They need to feel like they matter. They might also just be completely overwhelmed with raging emotions where you can't think through the consequences. People might be misinterpreted as being intentionally manipulative, but again, what they're trying to do is get their needs met, and they don't know how to do that otherwise. They don't feel supported otherwise. So it can feel like the light is switched on very suddenly, which again is very typical of a stress response, and it can feel to others around you like they're almost like a lighthouse attracting your attention. You run to it and actually the light could be turned off. So it can be, I hope that that kind of helps make some sense. It can be difficult, however, if you're not massively understanding trauma, you've not experienced this before, to understand why people behave like that. Like, actually, if we're thinking longer term, we don't want them to be going through trauma again, why would you behave like this? It's not helpful. It's not going to help them move forward. But our brains, obviously, their priorities set survival first, but then after that, also safety first. So after experiencing trauma, your view of the world, your experience of the world is now shifted. This is now your reality. If you've experienced ongoing, repeated trauma, this is now your normal. So as much as it might be distressing, actually there's familiarity, and our brains crave familiarity. They like to know how it's going to respond in a situation. So sometimes actually putting ourselves in situations that can be overwhelming and scary and distressing, because our brain knows the likelihood of how things are going to pan out, it knows how we're going to feel, it knows how we're going to respond. We've done this before, we've still survived. Then our brain will kind of almost be drawn to situations that it knows how to enact, it knows how to handle. And actually the not knowing, the unfamiliarity, can be a lot more scary for your brain and way more overwhelming for your nervous system. The other thing as well is perceived control. So traumatic events typically, by their nature, feel very out of our control, or the outcomes feel unpredictable. So again, we might engage in things that are perceived as self-destructive behaviours, that are, obviously not helpful, but actually it helps us to feel like we've got control over the outcome and we know how it's going to go. And that might look like this kind of, I'm going to push you away before you hurt me, for example. But behaviour serves a purpose, and as much as you might struggle to understand things initially, that doesn't mean it's not understandable, okay? So we're going to have a little think about this in action. So for example, what you're seeing is somebody that you perceive as self-sabotaging. So one of your oldest friends from years and years and years ago might be ignoring you. They might have distanced themselves from you. They're behaving really out of character. They're not seeing any of their friends anymore. They're going out all weekend, every weekend. They are taking every drug they can get their hands on. They're like Henry Hoover in a nightclub. Their new best friend is Charlie Sheen. They are becoming extremely promiscuous, getting in relationships with people that aren't good for them. And to you, you might be like, well, why? Why would you behave like this? You've already been through enough. Like, this doesn't make sense. We can understand this in a whole host of ways. It could be that they are, again, in that shutdown state and they're kind of detached from their emotions because they're trying not to feel any hurt. And all of this risky stuff is exciting. It's helping them to feel something again. It could be that they have got to a point of feeling hopelessness and feeling like, what's the point? It could be that, yes, do you know what, actually, I know that after spending all weekend around Charlie Sheen's house and not sleeping for the last 3 days, I know on Tuesday morning in work I'm going to feel morbidly depressed. However, that feels like that's because of my choice, and that's okay, rather than because of life feeling difficult. So it kind of brings in an element of predictability. It might be that because they feel like they're a terrible person, they're almost fulfilling a self-fulfilling prophecy, trying to prove to themselves that they're right about that. Because again, there's some safety and security knowing I am who I am. I might not know much about how the world's going to be, and that's all unpredictable, but I know me. It could be that you as your old friends are kind of subconsciously reminding them of their life before that they feel like they're not going to get back to because life has changed so dramatically. So actually, if they pull away from that, they pull away from the things that they used to aim for and hope and dream for, then they don't have to feel so bad about not achieving them. If we think about self-harm, for example, again, some people look at self-harm and think, well, why would you hurt yourself? What does that achieve? It doesn't make sense. You're just making things harder for yourself. But again, as a result of trauma, people typically feel overwhelming distress. They might feel isolated, alone, like nobody understands. Their self-esteem might be through the floor. They might experience shame, which again is extremely common in trauma. They might feel like they're not good enough. And that leads to extreme distress. I'm not talking again, you're in your window and I'm a bit upset, but I can handle it. Now that might push people trying to sit with all these overwhelming, unbearable emotions to end up kind of turning that inwards and harming themselves. And there's lots of evidence that would suggest that when we introduce physical pain on top of all that emotional pain, that can help tip us from that hypervigilant, Scooby, Scrappy-Doo state into that kind of shutdown state. So introducing the physical pain element can be the switch that helps them to stop feeling all that emotional distress. So again, it's serving a purpose. In that moment, it might also reduce the likelihood of them going around and smashing in their ex-boyfriend's car that puts them at risk of harm of them. It might reduce the likelihood that they do something else that's, you know, puts them at further risk. So actually, it's kind of the safest thing to do. But that might lead them to feeling more embarrassed, ashamed of themselves, withdrawing, feeling judged by other people or being judged by other people, which might then kind of start the process again. So again, it serves a purpose. So I'm going to just skim through a few of these. It's literally just a bit of an idea. Again, different ways of thinking about behaviours that you might otherwise struggle to understand. So engage in sex work, as I mentioned earlier, it might be that it helps you to feel in control of your body. It might help you to, rather than feeling like you've been used, tell you what, I'm going to take you. I'm going to take advantage of you and take your money. I'm going to use you. It might also make you feel valued and of worth. Abusive relationships might feel familiar. It might be that you've tried going out with James, the accountant, who was lovely and takes his nan to bingo every Saturday and is every grandma's favourite person ever. But to you, it feels a bit boring and it's unnerving because it's not all over the place. And that predictability feels unpredictable. You don't know how you're going to handle that. You're waiting for something to change. So actually, the unpredictability might help you to feel alive. Again, it might feel like it's exactly what you know. Flashbacks can be thought of as the brain's way of reliving the event so that you don't end up going through that again in the future. Again, this is a very simplistic way just to help you try to practice kind of recognizing all sorts of different ways to understand behavior. People be in denial. Well, I'll tell you what, if I'm in denial, then life, that bad thing probably didn't happen. No, it wasn't that bad. So life's not that bad then. It's all right. It's not too bad. They might also not be in denial. They might also have been dissociated and not remember. Or they might just not want to talk about it with you, which again, is absolutely okay. It might be that if people are depressed and they feel they've got absolutely no energy, no motivation in the world, nothing's enjoyable again, then actually, again, they're kind of keeping themselves safe. They're not taking themselves out into the world where there's a chance they're going to be hurt again. If you are somebody who intellectualizes everything and you don't think about emotions, people can come across as quite robotic. Well, then they're not having to feel overwhelming emotions. It helps them to feel in control. Eating disorders can give you, again, increase your perceived sense of control. It can make you invisible to other people. It's a safety mechanism. Anxiety, your brain is in super survival mode. It's predicting the worst to help you. Addiction, it might help you to feel something. It might help you to feel nothing. Also, focusing so much on feeding your addiction psychologically changes your focus of attention. So, as much as I said at the start, it's impossible in this short time to kind of cover every potential trauma response. What I hope you're starting to understand is that actually, no matter how people are responding in light of their experiences, it makes sense. We can understand it. When we feel valued, when we feel listened to, when we feel understood, rather than someone saying, well, just do it, just move on, just forget about it. When we feel listened to, when we feel validated, when someone says, do you know, actually, that makes sense now, why you feel like this, why you're experiencing this, you know, as a result, physiologically, our brain changes. That emotional response, that lizard brain, it lights up like a Christmas tree and it almost has like an aha moment. So showing kind of that compassion to yourself and other people can be quite life-changing. And now lastly on this kind of topic, you might think, well, I didn't respond like that. Look at me. I went through all that trauma. I'm absolutely smashing it. Why aren't they? Or it might be that you feel the opposite. You might feel like, why am I doing okay and somebody else isn't? We're all so different. It's unbelievable at the best of times. We all have different thoughts, different feelings. You know, if you're neurodivergent, for example, like I've got ADHD, I feel emotions more intensely anyway. Our fears might be different, our dreams might be different, our previous experiences might be different. There's also going to be a very, very different reaction to somebody who's come out of what, you know, was a burning building unharmed, thank God. But it might be if one person's going home to a one-bed council flat as a single parent with 4 children, they're now thinking, right, well, work's going to be short. How am I going to feed my kids? How am I going to feed me? How am I going to keep a roof over our heads? How am I going to feel safe? They're likely to have a very different post-traumatic experience, at the time at least, to somebody who's gone home to a support group waiting in the front room, the fire's on, you've got your favourite slippers out, you've got a hot chocolate waiting for you. So just because somebody might be responding differently to you and in a way that you perceive to be unhelpful, doesn't mean that they're going to respond like that forever. You meet people exactly where they are. But also, that doesn't mean that if you didn't live every aspect of their experience, you didn't live their day-to-day life for the last 35 years like they have, that you wouldn't be likely to respond in the same way. But like I said, all is not lost, okay? People are incredible, genuinely are. Like from the bottom, I think people are the most unbelievable things in the world, and nobody's ever too far gone. Nobody's ever too set in their ways. Nobody ever needs to be written off. And we're going to have a think about kind of moving forward and post-traumatic growth. So recovering from trauma is not easy. It's extremely difficult. It takes a lot of hard work and it can be draining. So again, if some people kind of aren't ready for that at the moment, absolutely understandable. But as well as that kind of talking, being around people, because again, what we want to aim for is getting back in that window where you feel safe with other people, you can be comforted by other people, and also you can kind of manage the peaks and troughs of life yourself. You don't feel too overwhelmed. However, it's also very, very difficult to kind of just talk your way through and then expect your trauma responses just kind of go away. So just talking about things in therapy all the time don't necessarily change all those physiological changes that have happened. So there's 2 little approaches that again can seem quite simple, because you know sometimes the little things done often can make a big difference. So the first approach is top down, and when we're talking about top, we're talking about our noggin, our brain. So again, if we're in that shut down dissociative state, there's a very good chance that our brain body connection is kind of a little bit off. You know, our brain's not necessarily recognizing signs that our emotions are changing, that stress is kind of kicking in, that type of thing. So things like mindfulness, things like yoga, meditation, tai chi, my God, if I put my teeth back in, they help you to recognize your emotions a little bit more. They help you to kind of improve that relationship with your body again. And mindfulness in itself, long term, can help you to turn down your emotional response, kind of quieten it a bit and help improve your ability to control them and manage them. And also, which I think is really powerful, there are studies that show that like 10 weeks of consistent yoga practice can markedly reduce symptoms of PTSD in people who might be struggling otherwise to respond to talking therapies, for example. The other way that we can do this is doing a bottom-up approach. So rather than kind of having our body go on and off like a light switch, we try to kind of bring back the dimmer. We want to turn it on a little bit. We want to be able to gradually turn it off again. So if we remember way back earlier, if we feel powerless, we feel like we can't act to change our circumstances, essentially we're more likely to end up with a trauma response. So what our body kind of wants when it's setting off all these hormones is for us to mobilize, to act, to do something. When we're in a state of mobilization and kind of shut down and frozen, our hormones aren't being used the way they're intended, and they kind of get stuck in our body, and it keeps us unnecessarily experiencing all that fight, flight, freeze response over and over and over again. Moving your body a little bit can help your body to regulate itself, release some of that emotion, and get yourself back to a baseline. And even in a life-threatening situation, if we're in that shutdown, if an opportunity to be active, an active survival presents itself, we can wake ourselves up. So really gentle movement, like kind of shaking a little bit, singing, humming, dancing. That EFT, the tapping, has got really popular because of this as well. It's kind of helping to discharge some of that stuck energy. And then you might have more chance of kind of getting back into your window, but also physiologically allowing yourself to feel and express emotions. If you're somebody who's kind of shut down your crying response and you don't express tears anymore, you feel like that's kind of been shut off. When we cry, again, there are endorphins in our tears. We're releasing some of that stress hormones. So basically kind of using our body to get ourselves back out of that shutdown response, maybe into that hypervigilant state for a little bit, but then we can come back into our window. So one thing I want to make very, very clear when we think about post-traumatic growth is that what I'm not saying is that it's all right then that you experience trauma, because look at you now, you're thriving. It doesn't mean that anybody should be pressured to rise from the ashes like a phoenix and be better than ever and just absolutely grow. Because actually, as much as 50% of trauma survivors experience post-traumatic growth, actually given the opportunity to lots of people would choose not to have experienced a trauma in the first place. Post-traumatic growth basically looks like growth in terms of your personal strength and your ability to manage your emotions, sometimes gaining in your appreciation of life. What we tend to see really essentially is that people use the experience as fuel. They refuse for it to have been for nothing. They are determined to find some meaning in this one way or another. And that often looks like wanting to help other people. It might look like a complete life overhaul. They completely changed their career. They moved to Thailand. I don't know what it might be. I'm being very... I'm thinking of someone famous in my head there. But yeah, okay. So this is essentially change. What improves the likelihood that someone gets to that point is a few things. So supportive relationships, again, opportunity to feel safe, whether that's from friends, family members, support groups, online communities, even sometimes therapy. Having that ability, the opportunity to learn to feel safe again with other people makes us more likely to end up back in our window, where that's our instinct anyway, and help us to stay there. Openness to new things, new beliefs, new ways of looking at things, new ways of trying things that eventually increase the likelihood that you're going to find stuff that works for you. Although that comes with time and feeling safe, and then looking for the things you can control. So lots of people will have heard of triggers. However, we also experience glimmers. So glimmers are considered to be like teeny tiny moments of your day that spark a little moment of safety, of joy, or of well-being. And they basically tell your brain, your body, that actually you're safe and well in the world. They don't have to last long. However, if we notice them, the more we notice them, the bigger the impact they have. They can be internal, like just noticing that actually your mind's been quiet for a couple of minutes and just feeling grateful for that. It can be external stuff like a hug from somebody, holding a pet and hearing them purr and feeling the heartbeat and the kind of the warmth from them, or the warmth of the sun on your skin. It can be anything. And I think sometimes the challenge can be that when people are seeking support for trauma, they might be told to do things like, oh, just have a bath, just try and have a cup of tea, try and calm yourself down. Those things they're more like glimmers than things that are going to actively kind of calm our trauma response down. But that doesn't mean that they don't serve a purpose when we're not in that hypervigilant stress response. So if we took this as our trauma, and here's our little glimmer, at first they seem insignificant because the trauma is so massive. However, if we're able to recognize them, sit with them, pay attention to them, they can help the trauma to start to feel smaller, and life can start to feel bigger around it. So what we're aiming for here is just little moments of safety, of joy, that gradually help life to kind of start to grow around the trauma, if that makes sense. Now, I love glimmers as well because to me, they also help with improving this understanding that two seemingly opposite things can be true at the same time. The world itself can feel unsafe because of your experience, and yet in this moment, sat with your cat with a cup of tea, you can feel safe for a second. Life can be very, very painful, and yet in this moment, sat with my best friends, laughing about something that we've seen on Instagram or TikTok, in this moment for a second, I can feel joy. And that's the reality of life, is that, feelings aren't facts. Thoughts, feelings change all of the time, and we don't have to be defined by these kind of moments of pain. Now, to experience glimmers, we've kind of got to recognize them when they're happening. So part of that is not sheltering ourselves too much initially from potential pain, because in doing so, we also shelter ourselves too much from potential to feel any different and joy. So gradually increasing moments of safety. So even if you can't kind of do that with other people, as much as we know that things like sight, sound, smells, touch, taste can all kind of trigger traumatic memories. It can all also be used to induce feelings of safety. So it could be that you've got a grandparent that was your absolute rock when you were growing up, and you can get a tub of Brill cream that reminds you of your granddad, or somebody's perfume or something that you can spray onto a cardigan and just hold. It could be, again, feeling a pet. It could be baking some cookies or something like that, because the smell again brings you back to a time that you felt safe and joy, hopefully, as well. Now, my favourite glimmer, I have to say, is laughter. So laughter, again, is another way that our body, by instinct, uses to kind of calm down our stress response, which might be why some people get nervous laughter. So when they're stressed, our body kind of makes us laugh, which again is as well as kind of moving our body and physically shaking and getting rid of some of that energy, it also massages that vagus nerve that kind of, again, travels from your brain to your body. And it basically makes it more likely that your off switch to your stress response is going to be able to turn on. So not only is laughter a little glimmer and makes life feel nicer in that moment, but sharing that with other people improves your social bonds and connectedness to other people, which again widens your window and helps you to kind of stay in there a bit longer. And also long term, it's an inbuilt way to kind of release stress, and it's enjoyable. So on that note, I remember right at the beginning, I asked you to kind of think, does everything happen for a reason? And my kind of response to this is only if believing that helps you. For some people, that will be helpful. For other people, it feels as though somebody's making excuses for the terrible things that happen to you. It can feel invalidating. It can feel like, well, you're just implying that everything always works out for the best. And I know that that's not the case. And it can feel quite dismissive. However, if for you, believing that everything happens for a reason allows you to overcome challenges, believe in your ability to get yourself through it one way or another, to have hope, to recognize that pain feels temporary, to feel like my life has purpose and I'm going to find a way to make this mean something, then go with that. But we're all very, very different, and we all need different things. Now, as I mentioned right at the beginning, what we specialize in really is completely bespoke training on anything for a workplace, anything that impacts your mental health, well-being, neurodivergence, trauma, stress, burnout, anything like that. Please know we're here. Please do feel free to get in touch. Follow us on socials. We're on Insta, we're on LinkedIn, we're all over the shop. And now I found this quote that I put in at the end that I quite like, because I felt like it was kind of balanced. So I feel like it kind of brings a bit of hope, but also doesn't invalidate trauma in itself. So we don't get over trauma or move on from trauma. We're forced to make space for it. We carry it, we learn to live with it, and sometimes we thrive in spite of it. So thank you all very, very much. So I'm sorry it's been a little bit challenging with the chat because every time I try to admit people, my chat vanishes. So I've not been able to keep on top of that without people chatting. In terms of workshops, we do loads and loads of stuff on Eventbrite. Have a look on our Eventbrite. There's absolutely loads of them. I think the next one's in 2 weeks. There's normally 2 or 3 a month.